Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I'm pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcoming you today to our Enterprise Cloud Data Security and Protection Summit, brought to you by Zerto, Cohesity, Lacework, and Commvault. The editorial staff of RedmondMag.com, AWSinsider.net, and Virtualization and Cloud Review have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. During today's third session, we will be giving away a Nintendo Switch, but you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors, Zerto, Cohesity, Lacework, and Commvault, available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Zerto, Cohesity, Lacework, and Commvault's underwriting of this content that we can bring you the summit. So we thank them for sponsoring and supporting the community and ask you to check out these resources so we can bring you more events like this in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Cloud Data Security Threats Outlook. This session features Stephen Smiley, AWS Ambassador and Consulting Director with ScaleSec. Stephen Smiley is an AWS Ambassador and Consulting Director with ScaleSec, a security-first cloud consulting partner that helps enterprises create or enhance cloud programs through cloud security strategy and hands-on architecture, implementation, automation, and integration services. Take it away, Stephen.
Hey, thanks so much for having me today. I just want to talk briefly about the role of cloud security, cloud data security. It's so important to so much of what we do today that I have really dedicated my career, and ScaleSec really focuses on providing services around this because it's just so important. And we're going to talk about the threats today. We're going to talk about the approach that we take to defending these things. And if you have any questions, I want to encourage our attendees to please put your questions in. I want to help you out as much as possible. And if you'd like to follow up with me or follow up with us later, please feel free to do that. We love to get those kinds of questions. So the first thing that we want to think about here is why are we even here, right? Like why should we think about our threats? And think about what they're doing and where we're going. We know that the consequences of a data breach can be severe. Ransomware impacts your company's reputation and the trust of your customers, loss of intellectual property, regulatory implications, right? Like you can get fined if you have requirements and you're not fulfilling them, and plenty of other legal and contractual liabilities. So we know that our data needs to be protected. We know that our threats are coming for us, and we need to be thinking about how to align our defenses with those threats. One of my favorite, art of war quotes here is to know thyself and know thy enemy. 1,000 battles, 1,000 victories, right? So we want to think about our own protections, and we want to think about what our enemy is doing, and together that's how we will be successful. So the first question I want to ask is, who is attacking data and why, right? Like what's going on their side, and what are they thinking about? Well, I pulled some statistics here from the Verizon data breach report just from 2023, and some public cases here. The majority of attacks on data come from external actors, right? So over 80% are coming from our external actors, and And who are they working for? Well, primarily organized crime, right? They are primarily through, groups that do this for their own living. And what are they after? Primarily money, right? And none of this should really be a surprise that they're coming after money, but sometimes we overemphasize these lesser known or these lesser frequent actors. So for example, we might think more and more about nation state actors or internal employees with a grudge. And although those definitely exist, and we can see them here in the statistics, those are not the primary threats to our data. But we still want to think about them. So, internal threats are still almost 20%, and then also our partners, right? It's a sliver here of the threat actors, but nevertheless, we want to think about how our partners may impact us. And then espionage is a minor part of our motive, but still it's significant. So that may or may not apply to you and your organization, but it's something to consider. And I also just want to think about how evil really these groups are, right? And that they will do anything to get their way. So some of the examples here we have from headlines are, cancer patients having ransomware of their nude medical photos, right? And in this case, the group did dump those photos online because they did not get the money that they were looking for. And then that same group, Black Cat, they threatened to leak plastic surgery pictures that they got of cancer of patients. And they just do this all the time. So these are not people that we want to be, reasoning about, but we do want to understand. We want to understand their motives and what they're doing. So one of the things that we can draw from this is understanding that prime targets are banks and exchanges. So in a lot of cases, they were really looking for cryptocurrency if there was cryptocurrency to be directly stolen. And then also the healthcare sector. Healthcare sector has some of the highest number of data breaches. So 67% of hospitals reported significant security incidents just within the last 12 months when they were surveyed. So if you're in those sectors, you really want to be taking extra precaution around your data. So how are attackers getting in? Well, here are the top vectors. It's no surprise that phishing is still the top vector. I mean, phishing is not new. It's been around for a long time, but it continues to be successful. Business email compromise attacks have nearly doubled, right? So somebody getting access to your business email is one of the most significant primary vectors that we need to be thinking about and protecting against. And then the second one is stolen credentials. So we're going to look at some real world examples of these, but if somebody has privileged credentials and those can be stolen and used against you, that's a significant risk. And it's pretty important to understand that 74% of breaches involve human error. So that is significant. If we can reduce this human error, that will reduce our risk significantly. But we also understand that humans are human and they're going to make mistakes. So we're going to do our best to put in proper mechanisms to reduce the impact of these errors. The other vectors are vulnerable APIs. So mostly these are just by mistake, but vulnerable APIs may provide direct access, and we are going to look at some examples of that today. And then unintentional data exposure. So this is like a public AWS S3 bucket or a public database, something like that. And this just continues to happen because people make mistakes and don't necessarily understand the impact of that until it's too late. Supply chain risks. So this is where we're talking about our partners. Either we've given a partner access to our environment for something and it's overprivileged, or maybe we are drawing from public libraries and we include those in our software, and then they have vulnerabilities within them. So Log4j was the big one recently, which led to the Log4 shell vulnerability, and we see that within 30 days of release, there was just a significant amount of activity of people scanning for applications with this vulnerability. And so the ability to quickly identify your applications and patch them was a huge enabler for successful organizations here. And then the last one is exploitation of vulnerabilities. And as security professionals, this tends to be where we spend a lot of our time thinking, right? We're thinking about cross-site scripting and SQL injection and server-side request forgeries. And these definitely still exist, but it's not the top vector. And we still need to close these holes. But I do think we want to continue to emphasize these top vectors. Phishing, stolen credentials in particular, is much easier to clean up than we think, and the rest of these risks. Okay, so another question is, how are our attackers finding targets? How do they find you, right? Are they targeting you specifically? Are they looking for your organization? Maybe. If you're something special, they might be looking for you. But they also probably are just trolling the web looking for anybody that has vulnerabilities. I've got a screenshot here. If you're not familiar with Shodan, this has been around for a while. But Shodan is basically a search engine that they map the web, and then attackers are going to go and look for particular characteristics that may match an exploit that they have, right? So in this case, I've got on the screen here, they're looking for Outlook web access on a kind of older web server, and they might know how to exploit this. And so you should probably know your own attack surface, right? This is how they are going to find you. See what you appear as on here, and make sure that that's your first priority for cleaning things up. Okay, so the other thing we know is that organizations continue to struggle with cloud security basics, right? So a handful of common issues just continue to pop up in environments like open firewalls, exposed databases, public buckets, and generally like no multi-factor authentication on the significant privileged users. So if you're an organization and you haven't thought about many of these issues, you can get an 80% solution just by looking at these common issues. And that is something that I do as a service all the time. Like, I will go in and just look for these hot things. I don't necessarily need to know everything about your environment and comb through it, and I can provide you a ton of issues. Now, obviously, you can do that internally with people who know what they're looking at. But these just continue to plague environments just because no one's taking the time to look at them. The other thing that we know is that there's this significant window between alerts and responses that leaves enough time for threat actors to achieve impact. So the Palo Alto most recent report on cloud threats said that they're often leaving more than 4 days between this response. And then, of course, if they do achieve impact and they're able to get some persistent access into your environment, they might be there for 90 days, 180 days. So closing this gap is significant. If you can get this down to where there's an alert between, you go, oh, hey, there's a vulnerability, and my team closes it within 12 hours, right, the next business day, maybe 24 hours, that is so much better that you're not going to show up on Shodan with that vulnerability. The other thing we know is that sensitive data just continues to proliferate across cloud resources. So when I work with organizations, one of the first questions that I ask is, where is your sensitive data, right? Like, where are your crown jewels so that I can focus my effort on protecting those? And I am always disappointed that they don't know. And they just say, it's got to be everywhere. And this just happens a lot because people are not spending the time to catalog their data or to think about, what is critical. It also comes up when I start talking about contingency planning. And I say, okay, so if this went out, how would you continue to do your critical business processes? And their answer tends to be, well, everything's critical. Well, that's not really true, right? Like, some things are more important than others, and we should be prioritizing and thinking about what those are. So one of the first steps here is going to be cataloging that data. Okay, and the last thing that we know here is that leaked credentials really are pervasive. So organizations continue to find credentials in source control, right, in Git, and they show up in GitHub, GitLab, wherever you've got them. They have them in virtual machine user data. A virtual machine needs to start and it needs to go pull stuff, and there's just hard-coded credentials in there. These are going to be the first things that attackers look for and exploit and use, and it's going to be very hard to figure out, where that came from, because they're just going to find that credential and use it, and you won't even know where that credential was leaked from. So this is something that we need to be spending more time, hunting down, removing, and then giving teams a better way to achieve these things, so that they don't make these same vulnerabilities. The next thing I want to talk about here is how to visualize potential attacks. If this is not a framework you're familiar with, this is something that you should broadly become familiar with, because it has largely become the standard for describing attacks and thinking about what attackers are doing. So MITRE has this attack framework that has these different stages of initial access, through persistence, escalating privileges, evading defenses, discovering resources, moving laterally, collecting and exfiltrating data, and then achieving impact. These phases help us understand the process of an attack, and it's not always perfectly, linear from left to right. They may start with some initial access, perform discovery, and then that leads them to privilege escalation and so forth. But it's important for us to just be thinking about, where along all of these things do I have protections that will prevent this from happening? Where do I have detections where I will be alerted if this happens, right? And then how will I respond to those alerts? Being able to visualize this attack will help us think about our threats, model them, and think about them before they happen. And so as we look at some of these examples, we are going to use this framework to think about it. So the first one that we want to look at today is an API exfiltration of customer data. Optus, this just happened last year, ended up spending over $140 million for this event. And we've got a screenshot here of what popped up on the hacker forum. So somebody just pops up and says, hey, I've got all this data, I'm willing to sell it. And hey, Optus, if you're reading, you have to give us $1 million within a week, or we're just going to sell this to the highest bidder. And so that's what that looks like. It just happens pretty fast. And Optus, you see, they ended up spending $140 million after compensating customers, paying for lawyers, and all the threat response that they had to do for this. So there was a lot of cost involved here. And here's how the attack went down. They had a public and unauthenticated API endpoint in their Google Cloud environment. So they used the Apogee product that's for API management. And that API was available since 2019. So it was sitting out there for 3 years, not necessarily with the same unauthenticated misconfiguration, but nevertheless, it was discoverable for a long time. And you can see in the URL here, there was some mistake with the way that this was set up, where it said it was api.www.optus.com, .au. And so this was just a misconfigured API endpoint that that really they just didn't know about, and they didn't understand its impact for a long time. When this was discovered by the attacker, one of the first things that they figured out is that they could submit a customer identifier, and they were sequential, which means that when they were calling the API endpoint, they could make sure that they were always asking for a valid customer identifier, but just by incrementing the identifier, and not get invalid API responses. So they were able to pull data from this very quickly. One of the things that they did to avoid detection was call this API from varying IP addresses. So this attacker was, fairly sophisticated, because they were at least able to orchestrate requests from a number of different locations. And so don't think that banning an IP for abuse is going to be sufficient, right? They will easily call from many different IP addresses. And then that API allowed direct retrieval of customer data, so they were able to exfiltrate it without any significant effort. And Optus eventually had to publish this on their website and say, "We are sorry, we're working to reduce this harm," but this really hurt their brand, in addition to all the direct costs. So let's think about some defenses that we would have put in place to prevent this attack. I hope you came up with some of the same ones as I did, and I'm sure there's a lot more. But the first one that I want to emphasize here is controlling and detecting our public API endpoints, right? So by detecting, I mean if somebody in your organization makes a new API endpoint that is public in your environment, will you know about it, and how, right? So that's the first step. The second step might be to actually control those and say, well, you're only going to be able to make a new public API endpoint with some amount of review, right? We don't want to get too much in the way of developers. We want to let them move quickly. But when it comes to making something public, we would like that to go through some sort of review before that is allowed to happen. And during that process, we want to make sure that it's meeting our standards for authentication. So this involves some process, definitely some technology, but ask yourself, if someone in my organization made a new public endpoint, how long would it take before I knew, right? The second one, and this is more on the application security side, is using customer identifiers that are sequential. We know that seems straightforward, but we know that that's not the best way to do it. Instead, we should be generating unique IDs, UUIDs for customers instead of incremental numbers. This would make it much harder to guess what a valid customer ID is. And if they tried to do this, but they didn't know the customer identifiers, we would have seen a large number of failed requests in our application monitoring, and we probably would have said, what's going on here, right? So that would have alerted us. And then the other one that's, I think, really important here is just strictly controlling which applications can access our sensitive data stores. So in this case, this API had pretty much direct access to a sensitive data store, which now we know that application was not well secured. So if you start from the center and kind of work your way out and say, hey, I've got this data and I want to be very careful what can access it, then you would have reviewed this application and you would have said, okay, before you get access to this, we're going to make sure that you've got a number of controls in place. And that would have prevented this from happening. So those defenses alone would have been enough. Okay, let's look at another one. In this case, a SIM swap. Let's see. I have a question here. When you say a public API endpoint, you mean something like Postman that developers use, and almost all cloud developers use a public API, but with authentication. So yes. So Postman would be a tool that would query the API, right? And the developers would use authentication for this, and that's great. As long as this is authenticated, there's nothing wrong with a public API endpoint, right? In fact, many of our web services, that's what they are, right? They have to be public. And we may have a private one that's just for an internal service, but right. So the answer is yes. As long as you are using effective authentication on that, and you have really considered that, then there's nothing wrong with a public API endpoint. But when a new one comes up, right? How do I know that this has effective authentication? That's the most important thing, is making sure that by the time it's public, it's properly secured. Thanks for the question. Okay, so in this next attack, we see a SIM swap lead to stolen credentials, which are then used to leak data. If you're not familiar with a SIM swap, it is something that we should all be aware of, because it happens on our phones, or it happens to our phones, and we need to understand that our phones and texting is not as reliable as we would like it to be, right? So the SIM swap process is that somebody figures out that a particular person is of a high value target, right? They get that person's personal details one way or another. But if you spend enough time on the web, you understand that everybody's details are out there, right? So they contact your phone company and they request to transfer your number to a new phone, right? And unfortunately, telecom companies do not do a great job of gating and authenticating you to make sure that that's a valid request. So in this case, they convince them to move the number to a different phone, and then as soon as that happens, your phone is cut off, right? You will no longer receive SMS, text, or phone calls, and instead, the fraudster is going to be getting those. If your two-factor authentication is via text, now they are getting those codes, right? So this is one of the reasons that many of us in the security industry are big proponents of hardware MFA, like a YubiKey or some other hardware device that cannot be stolen in this way. But understand that this can happen, and they can receive your codes. So okay, so they've got SMS codes. They can get into my account, but what are they really going to do with it? Well, in this case, the target was a DevOps engineer, and so when they got in, they had control of their email and source control accounts. So the first thing they're going to do with that email, right, is like reset a password, and and then they get into your GitHub, or they get into your source control. They clone all the repositories that the DevOps engineer had access to, and then they scan through them looking for access keys. So there are tools like Git leaks or Trufflehog. There's a few different things, but they're going to go looking for patterns to find access keys in these source repositories. And mind you, these tools are the same ones that you can use to detect if you have any in yours right now, right? But they're going to use the same tool. So they go and they found 10 that applied to 4 different cloud accounts, and one of them included the IAM full access permission. So interestingly enough, the credentials were not themselves to an administrator account, but if I have permission to change identity and access management, then I can create a new user with more privileged permissions, right? So it is effectively administrative. And in this case, they created new users that impersonated valid employee names. So they had done some research so that it would be difficult for us to determine that this was not a valid employee. Once they had those additional permissions, they went and enumerated all of our virtual machines, looked at all of our database tables and storage buckets, and looked for anything of value. They extracted all the source code repositories, and then they found the database tables that had sensitive information. They dumped them out, and then dropped those tables and deleted storage buckets, right? Because one of the things with the cloud is that they can't encrypt it in place. You can, create an encrypted copy, something like that, but you have to delete that original. So they deleted that original and then sent a ransom note saying, you have to pay us or we're going to leak this data. In this case, the victim refused to pay, and the data did show up. It took a few months, but it showed up on the dark web a few months later. So let's think about what would we have done to defend against this attack. Okay, the first thing is let's get rid of these access keys in our source control. Even though this was a private source control, we still don't want those in there, right? They're still sensitive, and we should be detecting those using a variety of tools. We should be removing them if we find any. And if we find them, we should definitely be rotating them so those are no longer valid, because somebody may have stored those and we don't know about it, right? So that's the first step. Second is we need to be removing and preventing these excess permissions. Whatever was committed to source here as an access key did not need IAM full access. We just can say that with 100% confidence. It needed more fine-grained permissions. We should also have alerts on new user creation like this. When this popped up, somebody should have taken a look at this and said, hey, did we do this on purpose? And if we had seen that alert, we would have said, no, these employees don't need new accounts. What's going on? Okay. The next thing is denying direct access to data. So even with full access to your cloud environment, you can still deny access on the resources. So specifically in AWS, we have two different types of policies that are relevant here. One is going to be on the identity, so that's on the person accessing it. And then the second one is going to be on the resource, that's a resource-based policy. If I have a resource-based policy that says, this sensitive bucket can only be accessed, under these particular conditions, even if the identity has full access, the resource policy is going to deny it. So that is a highly underused mechanism, but we need to be considering both. We want to make sure that we have permissions policies on the data, as well as least privilege identity permissions, right? So we can use those in conjunction to limit this risk. And then the other thing to think about is preventing destructive actions and alerting on them. So when this attacker went to delete a storage bucket or drop a database table, we should have either been able to prevent that. So in AWS parlance, we would use a service control policy that would say, deny delete bucket or deny deleting the objects in this bucket. Even if we don't want to specify a specific bucket, we can say deny deleting objects out of a bucket with a tag that says that this is of a sensitive class. And then that applies to all future buckets, right? Something like that. But we should be thinking about protecting that from deletion, either maliciously or accidentally, right? And then the other part of it is that we can, alert when somebody tries to do that, and that also would have set off alarms where we need to go and investigate. Okay, so let's look at one more. I'm going a little bit slow, so I'm gonna speed up here. In this case, we had an open Elasticsearch in AWS that exposed 3 terabytes of sensitive data. So this was discovered by a public, by a web crawler. They just found a public load balancer in AWS. The load balancer did not enforce access control. This was not on purpose. And by doing that, the attacker was able to just directly query Elasticsearch. And that Elasticsearch just contained a ton of stuff that should not be in Elasticsearch, including plain text passwords, connection strings to other databases, and customer and corporate data. So they were able to just directly exfiltrate this and have a big impact. This was on Thomson Reuters. So the big lessons here is detect these new endpoints, as we've discussed about before, ensure that they have effective authentication, and really never log plain text passwords and database connection strings. That should never be happening in your environment. So look into that. Okay. How can we improve, right? So we've talked about a number of issues here. How can we improve? The first one really is mindset and threat modeling, right? Have we identified our assets? Do we know where our crown jewels are? And do we have people responsible for securing them, right? Assigning ownership to this. As much as possible, we can automate this with some tools. We can automatically identify when new assets pop up. We can assign some ownership when that happens if we have effective boundaries. But we need to know, what are we even bothering to protect? And then the next step is enumerating the threats and risks. So, we know about our data, we know about our important assets. Let's think about what those risks are. And many tools can help us automate this, but we still need to take the time to think about it. When it comes to protecting things, identity and access management is going to be our first line of defense. As you can see in all of the cases that we discussed today, it involves somebody getting access. If we are limiting that access, alerting on changes, and using IAM effectively, we can protect things much more effectively than we think. The next one is keeping people away from data, using resource-based policies, and just generally limiting what can actually access it. If people want to run wild in our environment, that may present an issue, but it's not going to steal our crown jewels. Keep people away from data. And then the last one here is just learning to detect and respond quickly. As you can see in all of these incidents, there are many opportunities to detect an ongoing incident and respond, and we should have been thinking about that beforehand. Okay, I want to take a minute to talk specifically about cloud ransomware, because this is, the biggest concern. Everybody's talking about ransomware when it comes to data protection, and we want to take a closer look at it. So the Verizon data breach report found that 24% of breaches involved ransomware. Sophos actually found a lot more, up to 76% of attacks resulting in encrypted data. But the point is that this is going to be a major issue, and it's not going away anytime soon. The other thing to notice is that the average ransom continues to increase. In 2022, the average was, 800,000. It's now gone up to 1.5 million this year, and half of organizations are paying them. I want to say that this is a shame, because we should not be funding these organizations by paying the ransom. But I also understand that many of these organizations feel so much responsibility to the customers that would be leaked that they have to make that decision. Because this money is so significant, there's an entire service economy that's developed around ransomware capabilities. So people are selling access to ransomware groups. Ransomware groups are offering this as a service, and then they're handing it off to another service that focuses just on extortion. So there's an entire underground economy that's developed around this because the money is so significant. Organizations have started to publish some seriously helpful guides. CISA has a Stop Ransomware guide that they just put out this year. AWS has a blueprint for ransomware defense. So, if you have data that you really need to be protecting from ransomware, use one of these, think about it in depth, and set up some defenses. If we want to take a quick look at the AWS ransomware defense blueprint, nothing here is going to surprise somebody who knows AWS well, but it comes down to inventorying your cloud resources. They have a service for that with AWS Config. Inventorying your applications and software. Systems Manager inventory can do it. I don't see very many people setting this up, though. It takes a couple minutes to get this set up. Applying resource tags to your critical assets so you can find them. If you don't know where they are already, discovering and classifying them with automated tools like Macy. When it comes to protecting, we talked a lot about the role of email and business email compromise. This is not cloud specific, but mitigate that risk by using DMARC policies. Implement good MFA, particularly for email and VPN, that is going to be resistant to phishing and SIM swaps. This is another thing that I continue to see as an issue is people are not requiring single sign-on or strictly controlling access to root users. This is something that is kind of day one you have to get done. If you don't have this, I would be happy to help you get there. And then just really considering the paths to your critical data, right? As we talked about, kind of thinking from the inside out, what can reach my data on the network? What can reach it through cloud paths with IAM? And then being prepared to detect and respond, right? So having some threat detection. Amazon provides the guard duty service that is very effective, but you also need to respond to these alerts. And I see too many organizations maybe have this enabled, but nobody is looking at them, and that's not useful at all, is it? Right? Have an incident response plan and exercise it. Right? If this is something that you haven't done or you don't know how to do it, there's examples out there. AWS publishes some incident response examples, but think about it. You don't want to be thinking about incident response when you have an active incident. That is too late. Have a plan to investigate your CloudTrail logs, your S3 server access logs. So this is something where you may have a third-party SIM that helps you query logs. If you don't, you can set up CloudTrail Lake. I have an example of what that looks like, where you can just basically use SQL queries to look through, and they have some sample queries built in for common things. But be prepared to give access to an incident responder and let them look around to figure out what happened. And then the last step in ransomware defense is recovering, right? So I need to be ready to pull from backups and make sure that we have regularly tested them. And I need to make sure that my attacker is not going to be able to destroy them, right? So these backups are going to be segmented, properly encrypted, and immutable, right? Like they cannot be messed with. AWS provides a number of techniques for doing this through AWS Backup as a Service. They have a vault lock, which means that nobody, like this cannot be deleted or messed with once it's locked in. And then S3 has a similar capability where you can lock objects if that's where your data is. But think about, what is my data? How is it being backed up? And how am I going to make sure this cannot be messed with? And then enable quickly rebuilding your critical systems, right? Not every system is critical, so you don't need to go to extreme lengths on everything. But if you have critical systems that support your business processes that you need to have, you have to be thinking about, what is my tolerable downtime, right? How much, and when do I need to get this back up, right? My recovery time objective. If you have a golden image of your virtual machine, if you have a deterministic build definition where you can confidently get your latest version back up and running, that is awesome. You should have infrastructure as code to deploy and update your cloud resources so that you can say, oh, someone completely tore down my environment, but I can spin it back up in the matter of, an hour, something like that. Maybe I want to spin it up in a new region. That's going to take, a little bit more effort probably. But be ready to quickly rebuild your critical systems, and that is, and these are the keys to that. If you don't have that, which many places don't, that's okay. Go back and think about what it's going to take to get there. That's something I would be happy to help you with, because if you built an architecture in a web console, which many do, there are ways to get it back into infrastructure as code, or snapshot your images, things like that. So that is not the end of the world. We can help you fix that. I have a diagram here of how I tend to set up AWS backup and all the different protections that we talked about here. So one of the things you'll notice is that I've got segmented accounts, right? An account boundary in AWS is a very strict boundary. So my management account sets up AWS backup and delegates administration to a dedicated backup account. That backup account is where we have backup plans and vaults. So this account is going to be strictly controlled in terms of access. Then in my workload account, so this is where I'm actually keeping my data, I just tag my resources with the appropriate tag, and AWS Backup applies the backup plan to it. And then that sends its backups to the vault where they can't be messed with. So you want to think about this architecture as it applies to you, but this is how I tend to set things up. And then the other really important thing that I have are service control policies that will prevent any messing with this setup. So you can't modify my backups or vaults or plans or delete them. And so then I've got strict control over my management account and my backup account. And then I can let my developers have a lot more leeway in their workload account because they're not going to accidentally break this stuff, right? So think about that as it applies to your cloud. But when it comes to ransomware, you really want to have this planned out in depth. Okay, I know I threw a lot of information out there. I would love to field any of the questions that you have. So let's get into some Q&A.
Yeah, let's do it. That was some great info. Let's see how many we get through with the remaining few minutes we have here. Here's the first question. Do we need to worry about cloud providers accessing our data?
That's a good question, and that's one that we get a lot from people new to cloud. My answer in short is no. We don't need to worry about cloud providers accessing our data. They really have many protections to prevent that from happening, and I don't think it's a major concern. Google Cloud actually has a special mechanism where you can be notified of any manual things that are happening underlying their systems. AWS does not provide that, but I have never found organizations that care too much about that concern. I will say though that if you do have a need where you're really concerned about that, you can absolutely remove that concern through effective encryption, right? So if your cloud provider may manage some encryption keys, and they do have those keys, but if you don't want them to, if you want to manage your own keys, you can do that, even using their services. And so if they did, in the rare event, access your data, they would just be getting encrypted data to which you have the key and they don't. So that depends on your threat, profile, what you're concerned about. But no, I don't think you need to worry about it.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next one. Can we use the cloud if we need our data to stay in a particular geographic location for compliance reasons?
Oh, that is a good question. One of the first concerns that people used to have with cloud is thinking, oh, well, once it's in there, it's just going to go everywhere, right? There's no way for them to limit it. And cloud providers have taken a different approach to this. So AWS has these strict region boundaries where it's definitely not going to move without you asking for it to. Google, on the other hand, has built this global network, and they had to implement some data residency controls later to make sure that things were not being moved inadvertently. So if you're in Google Cloud, you have to set up some. They have this assured workloads setup that will help you with compliance things. But basically, yes, you can absolutely use the cloud and restrict your data to particular locations, and you can work around those compliance restrictions.
Okay, great. This next question you briefly touched on with your first answer. How does encryption play a role in security cloud data?
Yeah, so we talked about that a little bit. You should be considering whether or not you want to have a customer managed key or allow the cloud provider to manage that key for you. In any case that I want to let my cloud provider manage that key. It's going to make it a lot simpler. And then the other thing to consider is that if you are encrypting data like within a database, for example, and you want to do envelope encryption, where you may use a cloud provided key to encrypt a data encryption key, something like that, then you can do that, and that is a common architecture. So you'll want to think about where that encryption is happening and where you want to be able to retrieve it. And of course, you always want to protect your keys, because one of the concerns with cloud is that if somebody were to shred or delete your key, it effectively shreds your data, right? They don't even need to delete it; they just need to delete the key. So you need to consider that.
Okay, let's squeeze in one more question here before the end of our session. If we purchase cybersecurity insurance, do we still need to worry about all of this?
Yeah, so cybersecurity insurance has definitely increased in both amounts that people are purchasing as well as prevalence, right? Many organizations have it. One of the things that we're seeing more of lately is that those insurance providers are refusing to pay if they perceive that you were negligent in protecting your cloud, right? So you absolutely still need to worry about this, because they will just come back and say, well, you didn't even do the bare minimum, right? I'm not going to pay for this if you were negligent. So cybersecurity insurance still has a role to play, and you're probably still going to need to purchase it, but you also need to make sure you're not being negligent.
Okay, great. That looks like all our time for today. Thanks for the great presentation, Stephen.
Thank you so much for having me today.
All right, everyone, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of our hour for our second session, Cloud Data Security and Protection Best Practices. Take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Zerto, Cohesity, Lacework, and Commvault, and we'll be right back.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session called Cloud Data Security and Protection Best Practices, brought to you by our sponsors, Zerto, Cohesity, Lacework, and Commvault. Our speakers for this session are Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill Sr., Chief Technologist at AWS Solutions. Dave is a highly accomplished technology professional and Microsoft MVP specializing in Microsoft Azure, hybrid cloud solutions, and cybersecurity. With over 20 years of experience in the IT industry, Dave has established himself as a trusted advisor to organizations of all sizes, helping them navigate the complex world of Microsoft technologies and optimizing infrastructure. As a sought-after speaker and presenter, Dave has delivered engaging sessions at numerous industry conferences, sharing his expertise and insights on topics ranging from cloud migrations and security to disaster recovery and infrastructure optimization. His ability to simplify complex concepts and provide practical guidance has earned him a reputation for delivering informative and actionable content. John is a chief technologist with more than 25 years in IT, having worked as a consultant, architect, executive, speaker, and author. He has been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects, and John has also authored material for Thomson Reuters Aspiratory books and exec blueprints, and develops courseware for Pluralsight. And he favors short, succinct bios. So thanks for that, John. Okay, guys, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Well, that's
Thanks,
great.
David.
Awesome. You know what? I got to say, the best part of my week is getting to do this kind of stuff. And we have some amazing content to go through here today. I know John and I are so pleased to be here. And happy Friday, everyone. And we really hope that you enjoy the show. A couple little pieces of housekeeping that John and I always like to do is we always like to keep these sessions informative and interactive. So if you have any questions, feel free to type those in your Q&A panel, and we will try to get to absolutely as many of those as possible live during the show. All right, John, and with that, let's get going. So I think probably one of the big things when we look at, protecting, hybrid clouds and kind of cloud security in general, I find a lot of organizations have done a lot better job with their on-prem infrastructure because it really feels like it comes naturally to them. They've got standard operating procedures in place. They've got their teams trained on how to deal with, on-prem hybrid infrastructure. But when it comes to the cloud, I still find that there's a lot of gaps that are inside of there. So what are you seeing in the field right now with, just some of those challenges in getting started with cloud protection, and where's a good starting point for organizations?
Well, Dave, hey, first off, it's great to be here with you again, my friend. This is definitely the best part of my week is when we get to do these things and meet with fellow IT pros and discuss the the topics of the day, and this one, couldn't be more relevant at the time being. So, I'm really excited to get through this and talk about some of the getting started and often as technologists, we jump into the technology part of it, and that kind of overshadows, or we forget or minimize the people part of it. And you've heard me say it a million times, and probably we'll hear it a million more, that cybersecurity begins with a security-first culture. So, getting started on your cloud data security begins with ensuring that your organization understands and commits to the importance of security across your IT resources, whether it be on-prem or in the cloud. And then, you have to get into the nuances. So once you have the culture and you have the buy-in, then you have to really make sure everybody understands the differences between protecting things on-prem and protecting things in the cloud, because I think a lot of folks, particularly those that don't really live or work in the cloud, they think that, just because I put it in the cloud, it's secure, right? That somehow that adds a layer of protection. And it does from a DR standpoint. If you had a fire or a flood or that sort of thing, certainly being in the cloud would offer some protection. But when it comes to data security, data integrity, that kind of thing, you don't automatically just gain that by being in the cloud. You have to take very specific actions, and often they differ from what you take on-prem. Wouldn't you agree, Dave?
Absolutely, John. And to that point, it's the way that I illustrate this with getting started with the cloud for organizations that I deal with is, don't be a victim of next finish. And so I think everybody that's on this call would have at some point in time installed, Windows or Linux distribution. You can download the ISO, and you can pretty much next finish your way through the install to the point where you can log in and do something on there. Does that mean that it's hardened? Does that mean that it's locked down? No, you have all of the default configurations. And with that point, kind of going through the cloud, John, Microsoft has done a fantastic job of helping organizations close some of those holes by doing things like providing pre-hardened images in a partnership with the Center for Internet Security, for example, where you can have an image that's already locked down for you, that's compliant. However, you can still pick the next finish image if you choose as one of the default gallery items. So there's a little bit of education that I think has to go on with, how you spin up and how you build these tenants and how you lock them down. Now, the good news is the vendors give us really good tools to show us how we're doing from a scorecarding perspective. And, as we go through this, it's not such a daunting journey. Just, my advice is try to at least make a few changes in the right direction every day, and you'll get to, your final destination. Okay. So the next one that we have here, John, is, assessing your data. Would you agree, John, that data is the new currency for threat actors? Because we've all been battling, cyber attacks on some front in our infrastructure. And for all intents and purposes, it's work for the bad guys to take and go through and ransom you and have to negotiate with you and do these things. It's a lot easier if they can just sneak in, steal your data, prove that they've got your data, and then take and hold you ransom for that without even having to load a single binary inside of your infrastructure, right? And so that's a big piece. And so when we look at the data classification and how that is brought along into performing a risk assessment for an organization, this is an area that I find is often left behind, because most organizations want the magic quick fix. They want, okay, I just need to have an agent on here, something with the word advanced and threat protection, and I'm going to be okay. Well, that doesn't really help you for your data. What type of data do you have in your organization? What type of data is highly sensitive? Who has access to that highly sensitive data? How does that data leave your network? Do we have controls over how that data leaves the network? These are all things that are part of the process as intangibles. Like we can lock down, we can harden with security templates, as I mentioned in the previous slide, but we still need to understand what it is that we're doing with our data. And so, the big piece here is, I think understanding what that looks like holistically. And you deal with this on almost a daily basis with, a lot of the stuff you work on with your projects, John. And so I'm curious as to your insight with, assessing and classifying that data on your network.
You're absolutely right when you say, data is the new currency or the most important currency when it comes to protect. Because what is the purpose that most organizations invest in technology? It's to gather and use data to run their operations or service their customers, whatever that may be, in faster, more efficient, less costly manner. So it's the data that really matters to them. The commodity items, of course, there's costs associated with them, and you don't want to bear those if you don't have to. But replacing a piece of server hardware is X amount of dollars. It can't be increased by an attacker, doing something different to it or whatever. It is that fixed cost. Whereas your data could have significantly different value based upon what its impact is to your organization's operations, right? Let's look at the case of the college you and I have talked about that was ransomed in December and ceased to exist by May of the following year. And essentially what, was at the root of that was the data that was ransomed prevented them from accessing and seeing what their enrollment numbers were. Without that data, they were unable to make the proper adjustments to their operations, so that by the time they got access, it was too late. They were too far in the hole and out of business they went. So, your data, and it's important to you, are really where the focus of your protection efforts begin after you take and you create that security first culture, because, you shouldn't be protecting your team picnic flyer in the same way that you're protecting your payroll database. Obviously, that makes common sense to most people, but you wouldn't believe how many organizations we run into, Dave, where they're just like, oh, well, I just installed the agent across all the devices and everything is protected consistently. And in this case, I think a deeper scrutiny and understanding and classification is necessary. And you can't do it on the fly. This has to be an exercise where you document it, where you understand it, and you communicate it. Because not for nothing, but this exercise will have a lot to do with the expense and availability of your cyber insurance policies and those things.
Yeah, John, and along the lines of your university, that's terrible. Like, that's an organization that's been around for a very long time. And actually, just recently, the uptick in attacks in the oil and gas sector, especially where I live up in Canada, has been at a profound level. Our largest oil and gas firm, a company called Suncor, they run a series of gas stations and along a lot of other things, Petro-Canada, so all of our main gas stations, just got hit by a cyber attack. Now, it's a little sketchy on the details right now, but it is public knowledge because every single one of their gas stations went down. They couldn't accept payment. And so these types of attacks are out there. They're real. And, that to me would be like almost something that would be coming across as like a state-sponsored type attack. And, we need to make sure that we're protecting our infrastructure and we take this stuff seriously. And so along those lines, recovery part of this is, we hear about ransomware with the word encryption. We are going to get our data encrypted. Well, encryption isn't a bad thing. We've been using end-to-end security and encryption solutions for years to try to protect our own data. Now it's just kind of being used against us. But one of the big pieces of this, John, is that when you have your data that's living in the cloud or even on-prem, how are you protecting that? And one of the big pieces, and I still see this today, we've had solutions like BitLocker, whole drive encryption available for laptops and mobile devices and servers for years. You'd be absolutely horrified, John, as to how many organizations are still not using that. And it does not take somebody very long to grab a device that's been forgotten in the back of an Uber or cab to crack into that device and gain access to critical information and get a foothold on your infrastructure. So protecting data at rest is one part. Protecting our data by encrypting it ourselves on secured devices and our general population is also huge. And one of the big pieces that is red flagged for a lot of storage accounts in the cloud is data encryption. So if that thing gets hacked or you need to get into it, you need to make sure that you've got recovery keys available to you. Now, along that line, key management is also very important, because I heard in the last session something along the lines of encrypting your data and throwing away the key. Well, if you throw away the key to encrypted data, you're not going to be getting that back. And so you need to make sure that you've got strong practices in place for key management as well with your encryption. Now, BitLocker has a whole solution around it. That's not a problem. But some of the other key management solutions you've got to take, and you've got to make sure that you're looking after things. So what are your thoughts on data encryption, John?
Well, I can't really top what you just said. So, I mean, it's all very valid. Every comment you made and, emphasized, everybody should be taking to heart. And it does surprise me, the number of endpoints that I see, the number of organizations I see that aren't really taking a holistic approach to encrypting their data. They think about encryption in terms of, well, when we establish a VPN, that's encrypted or whatever. And I'm like, okay, so that's data in transit over the VPN. But what about when you move data from your plant floor to your front office? Are those connections encrypted? What about when it's stored on a laptop that's out walking around? And, something that just happened to me today, a family member and their computer was stolen. The car broken into last night. Well, I'm happy to say that it's got BitLocker full disk encryption on it and those kind of things, and we store the BitLocker keys in Active Directory and do different things that way to be able to secure that, and full holistic encryption across the organization where your data lives, whether it be up in the cloud or on-prem, on an endpoint or on a server, needs to be looked at, planned, and implemented in every organization as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's always a scary situation where you get that device that's taken, because then you always have the concerns of, what type of remote wipe capabilities do you have on that and tracking it down. So yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So now one of the next big pieces, and this is one of the ones where I feel the cloud really shines for us, John, compared to on-prem, is that there's native identity and access management features available for us in the cloud. So we can start enabling things like privileged identity management, taking a low privileged account and the concept of only elevating for the tasks for a period of time to perform those roles and functions, and not leaving accounts hanging out in the cloud or even on-prem that have elevated privileges in an enabled fashion, right? And so that really stands aside. And the other part of it is the really deep role-based access control capabilities that we have inside with our cloud providers. I think they've done a really good job with that. And so when we look at locking things down, a big piece of advice that I've got for everyone listening on this call is that you're going to have an Office 365 tenant that's going to be set up. 98% of people are in some type of cloud type email solution. There are things called global administrators inside of there. Watch who has access to that, and you need to model some scenarios of compromise of those admin credentials in the cloud and how fast you're going to be able to recover from that. Because, when we take and we have these situations, it's not just on-prem infrastructure that the threat actors are going after. It's also our cloud-based infrastructure. And you'd be shocked as to how much access those global admin accounts have across not only your Office 365 tenants, but also your Azure tenants and, a lot of infrastructure that you're running up there. So modeling that and building in solutions with conditional access to prevent where these things are being able to log in from, and also enforce multi-factor authentication, those pieces are huge for the setup. And along with that, Microsoft also walks you through creating what's called a break glass account. So in the event of emergency, we can get back into the tenant. You'd be really surprised, John, how many calls I've had in the last 2 months where organizations have locked themselves out because they were configuring conditional access policies. They made a mistake, and now they actually have to go through a recovery process with a vendor like Microsoft. And it is not as simple as just calling them up saying, hey, oopsie daisy, I did this. No. You need to provide proof of ownership of the domain, of your organization. You're involving like the C-suite in order to getting that access back, and it's really not pretty. So when you're locking things down, make sure that you're careful with that as well. Any thoughts on this one, John?
Well, so I do have a good thought on this one that I'd like to share with everyone, and that is to, remember that every privilege is access to something. So even if you think it's a mundane privilege, when you leave a privilege hanging out there for an account, let's say dormant or that kind of thing that you mentioned earlier, you're weakening your defenses. I put it this way. You have a lock and a deadbolt on your door. Do you choose to lock both when you leave, or do you just lock one or the other? You might just lock one or the other, but you need to understand that that's a weaker form of security than both. So any privilege that you leave in place is a weakening to your security. And so a tactic that I often encourage people to use is to, really look at their onboarding and offboarding processes, offboarding specifically in this case, to ensure that they're communicating properly with HR to understand when somebody's leaving the organization and what rights did that person have in their system. And, for a lot of organizations nowadays, Dave, both their HRMS system is in the cloud and their identity management system is in the cloud. So Azure Active Directory, that sort of thing. So you can develop some process flows whereby you can periodically compare the presence of active teammates in that HRMS system versus active accounts in your Azure Active Directory. And then spit yourself out some nice reports. I use PowerShell to do a lot of this stuff. And then you can go back to HR and be like, hey, I'm showing that this person left the organization, but their account's still active. Where did we break down the communication? And really strengthen that up so that when somebody leaves your organization, HR is letting the IT team know right away, and the IT team is taking very specific actions to ensure every license, every privilege, every access is being properly revoked.
Awesome, John. Awesome. Yeah, and we have a question that just came in here as well, and I can take this one, John. It's the question was, what do you mean classified data based on risk level? So classifying your data would go through a process of highly privileged or like top secret data. So for example, if you're an organization that has patents surrounding a specific technology, that would be kind of one case where it would be highly sensitive data that you don't want to get out. The second piece of that could be data that you're bound under a non-disclosure agreement with a business partner, and you've got to guarantee that that data will remain only on secured devices and only viewed by specific individuals. And so part of that part of that process is also restricting like what you can email outside where files can go as well inside of your organization. So awesome. Now, one of the big attack vectors when an organization is hit is our backup infrastructure, John. And so because the bad guys, the threat actors that are out there know that if we can recover that data in a reasonable amount of time, there's a high likelihood that we're not going to be paying the ransom. The whole goal of ransomware is a for-profit business, like organized crime. And so, they want to take and they want to see some type of payment or remuneration for their hard work in encrypting all of our data. And so one of the things that the bad guys will go after first when they're reconning the infrastructure is as part of their dwell time. That's the dwell time is the amount of time that they're in your infrastructure before they'll execute. When they're in your infrastructure, they're going to be hunting for your backup targets and your backup infrastructure, because if they can impede that ability to take and recover, that's going to be huge. So one of the things that John and I recommend immediately organizations look at is look at where your backup infrastructure is actually stored. Like, is it in your primary domain that you do have all of your business operations right now? To think about this, what happens if you have some type of admin level compromise in your primary domain and your backup infrastructure is in your primary domain? You can easily make an assumption that your backup data is also going to be compromised. So what we recommend is moving that out into what's called a fabric, and that fabric would be a separate Active Directory domain, a separate Active Directory forest, separate set of credentials, highly secured. It's a greenfield environment where you don't have to worry about 20 years of Active Directory running and not being able to make changes because you don't know who set this up because you rolled through staff. You have a chance to do it right off the bat. Lock it down, harden it. There's partners out there like Center for Internet Security that can help you lock that down and move that backup infrastructure over there. Move the management plane of your hypervisors over to that infrastructure, and that's going to be huge because you have to protect that backup data at all costs. John, what are your thoughts around just the threat actors actively going after backup data? Is it more production?
Absolutely. You know me and my analogies and my fondness for them, and so the one that I make up or use for this often when I talk to people is I'm like, hey, you've been kidnapped by the bad guy and you wanna escape, but you see they've got 2 cars there they could chase after you with, so you pop the tires on the first car. Do you leave the other tires in place? No, because they would just take that second car and chase you down and catch you again. So that second car is your backup infrastructure, and in this case, in this analogy, the escaping person is the bad guy, the cyber attacker. They want to make sure that when you try to chase them to get your data back, to get your systems back up and running, that you don't have that second car to go after them, that you have no options. That's really what their goal is. Leave you with no option other than to give them what they want or go out of business or cease to operate. If they can get you there, they know that they own the situation. So your role is really to ensure that doesn't happen. And as you mentioned, Dave, our secure fabric design has held solid for many of our customers and organizations that we help. That's a great path to it. Immutable backups. A lot of people introduce immutability or on-changing backups through software control, but you and I have implemented it even through hardware, right? Where we have automation that manually or automatically turns on a network port long enough for a backup to occur and then turns it off. We've had people take backups to an external drive or a cloud resource and then take it offline. I've even suggested to people that they have a second Azure tenant that it's where their backup systems live. They keep copies there and everything else, but it's completely disconnected, if you will, from that primary tenant. It seems like a lot of extra work and a bit of extra expense, because it is, but compared to what it will cost you in the event that you are successfully attacked, it's minimal, right? This is all one form of insurance or another. We're trying to invest a little now to protect us against a huge loss later. And the best case scenario, we never need any of it.
Okay, John, we have a question that was actually written into me prior to the session here, and it was, we are in this situation right now where all of our backup infrastructure is living in the primary domain. How hard is it to actually implement this secure fabric and move over those backup resources? And how long does it typically take?
You want me to take this one, Dave?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So the good news is, if you put a concerted effort towards it, you can begin to reap the benefits of a fabric, get it up and running in a relatively short period of time, right? You're setting up a completely separate identity management, so forest domain, that sort of thing. So that does take some planning and some time. But this isn't something that is going to take you months to get in place. This is something that, if you get people who are strong with Active Directory design, or, if you use some other identity management system, that sort of design, and you get them on board to help you, you can have something up and running in, days, and then begin to systematically move your infrastructure over to it. There can be a period of migration. It's not an all or nothing thing. This isn't necessarily a rip and replace scenario. You can do migration to it. In fact, Dave, you and I have done this before, right? Where we've had to systematically take very geographically dispersed large organizations, and one by one we tackled them and moved them over to the fabric we created, and in short order. So weeks and months, sometimes it takes months depending on the organization's complexity, but we eventually ended up with what used to be hundreds of servers that were integrated in the primary domain being moved over to this secure fabric where they now live and are protected quite well and happily. So Dave, what are your thoughts on that? Did I cover it about right?
Yeah, and you're absolutely correct. The amount of time that it takes to me really doesn't matter, because it needs to be done. Because the moment that you have a situation that you can't recover from, time is nothing to the organization. They'll spend as much time as required. The one point that I do want to make with creation of a fabric is, when you're securing these backup assets, there's nothing that says that you can't take this and next level this as well. So you're thinking, okay, well, maybe my hypervisor's in one fabric, maybe my backup infrastructure in another fabric. Sure, more fabrics the better. You're trying to make it difficult on the bad guys to get through your infrastructure. It's all for naught, though, okay? And this is my one piece of advice. If you have bad habits from an administrative perspective in your primary domain, the odds are that you're going to have bad habits inside of your fabric. You need to be rigid and very strict in the fabric, and you're not everybody's best friend. Not every IT professional in your organization needs access to the fabric, okay? You don't have to go in there every day from a management perspective in the same way as your primary domain, and you just need to maintain that strictest level of control. And the other piece of this is you're always going to be looking at ways to improve this. It's not a set it and forget it. Nothing in security is set it and forget it. All right. Now, John, we're looking at taking and protecting that data, because data is that new currency that we have, right? Putting in a structure in place that's going to take and help us work as an organization is so key. And, having our advanced threat protection agents and the configurations and actually turning on data loss prevention or DLP inside of your infrastructure is not something that's just turned on by default. You have to go through and configure this inside of your tenants. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that this is one of the cultural shifts that you have to take and work through inside of your infrastructure and with your user base and with your executives. How many times have we seen the emails for DLP alerts coming up, and it's something to deal with an onboarding practice, and somebody's social security numbers are being passed plain text, and we're getting alerts on that. We go back to the HR department that's in charge of this, and they're like, well, this is our process. This is how we get it there. Well, simply put, that process needs to change. It's not acceptable to do that. In the same way that you classify that data and you watch like a hawk those privileged items that are inside of your infrastructure not leaving, and having a measure where you can say, listen, who's actually touching this secured data? Who has access to it and who has opened it? And let's pull some reports on this as well, right? And so, John, I know that this is one of the big areas that we have to deal with. I find that this is almost an intangible for us as IT professionals, because we really like to deal with speeds and feeds and hardware and infrastructure, cloud-based infrastructure. And the data side of this is a little tricky for a lot of us. So what's a bit of advice that you would have, a couple little gold nuggets surrounding data loss prevention here, John?
Well, one, compliance is black and white. It is not a gray area where you can justify it, and you shouldn't be justifying it to yourself, and you can't justify it to others. And what I mean by that is that if you have to comply with HIPAA or high-tech, or you just have customers that say, hey, you're going to work on our program and we require you to take certain steps to protect losing any of our proprietary data that's kept on your network, you're expected to comply with that. And simply saying, yeah, we're going to comply with it and then doing nothing, you can't justify that away by saying, well, this is what we needed to do to be able to do our job, or we didn't understand how to do it differently. No, it's black or white. If you're saying you will comply, then it's your job to learn how to comply. And that may mean that you have to look at it, and you may have to have that conversation with an engineer who has that CAD file, and he, has it on his phone, and you're like, no, our agreement with that customer says that we're not allowed to have it outside the confines of our physical network. Well, that means he doesn't carry it around and go to McDonald's with it on his phone or anywhere else. Compliance is black or white, or black and white. So
awesome, John.
Remember,
we've got it. Sorry, John. We had another question that was coming. I didn't mean to cut you off there. And this one here is back to your point about immutable storage. So this question's for you. Every vendor claims that their solution is immutable. What do you consider the characteristics of a true immutable backup?
Well, Dave, for me, I insist on both software level and hardware level protections to really give me the confidence that I have an immutable or a non-changeable backup. And that goes to what we were talking about earlier, right? So I'll use the software tools that are built in that say, hey, configure this thing as immutable so that it can't be overwritten, it can't be changed. But then I also rely on those techniques of, physically segregating it from my network by turning off the network port or disconnecting the cable, things like that. And I know that a lot of software companies will say that's unnecessary. It's only unnecessary until the compromise that no one expected happens, right? And pretty much every compromise is something no one expected to happen. So I will take both software and physical separation to create my immutable backup strategy.
Awesome, John. All right. So the next one that we're going to have here is dealing with, the part of, you've got an active incident that's taking place. And little true story here. I've been working with a customer, as you know, you've been helping me with this one over the course of the past couple of weeks, where we've got pretty good defenses in place to detect when anomalies are happening on the network. And I'm helping this customer currently fend off and battle a live cyber attack. There's somebody that's coming through and trying to ransom their infrastructure. And so having the ability to, look at this type of event and everything that goes on along with it, incident response as part of your disaster recovery plan is so huge for organizations. I was recently at a very large conference, John, and we had a chance to watch one of the keynote presentations. And it was the incident response that came from the city of New Orleans. There's been a lot of municipal and government agencies in the United States that have been hit recently, and New Orleans was one of them. And one of the big takeaways that I had from that is that they actually developed a secondary cyber DR response plan, and they did something that I feel a lot of organizations are lacking. And they actually practiced a live event where, infrastructure went down. What happens if this key server goes down? We're told by the business that if this goes down, we'll go back to pen and paper, and it's survivable. It's not super critical infrastructure until it's actually off. And then somebody realizes that there's some application in there that they can't actually live without. And so practicing this cyber DR plan for me is so important, and having a secondary cyber DR plan is so important. And building that in as part of an incident response plan, this is something that we all need to take away and do a better job of, because almost every organization I find has a measure and level of improvement that they can have around this incident response. Waiting until you're under attack is not the time to practice your incident response plan, because you need to find the holes and the gaps in that ahead of time. And we need to make time for this, because if you don't practice, you're not going to get any better, and you're not going to figure out where your holes are. Think of a professional sports team, John. Imagine if that professional sports team never stepped foot on the ice in Canada or on the field, on the turf, baseball, hockey, soccer. They never practiced. It'd be a pretty interesting game. It would be a lot of chaos, right? And so, John, what do you do to help organizations level up their game for incident response in regards to disaster recovery?
Well, it's all practice, right? You practice, you play like you practice, so you better practice like you play. And that's not my quote. Many people have done it. But essentially what it means is when you're out there on the field trying to win that game, or on the ice trying to win that game, how you act and what you do will be how you practiced. So if you practice always like you're in the attack, you're fending off the attack, you're responding to that incident, and you model it just like you just went through, Dave, then eventually it becomes muscle memory and brain memory, obviously, to the point where your reactions are consistent and the same every time. And this is a bit, I'll say, unusual for a lot of folks in IT, because we're dynamic thinkers. We're relatively dealing with problems that have never been seen before, so we're trying to kind of on the fly develop our solution and that sort of thing. And in an attack, that approach is usually less than effective. You really need to have your defined incident response plan that you have practiced, and you execute with precision.
Awesome. So, John, I know the next one that's coming up here, this is something that we've actively been working through. And this is our vendor and supply chain security. So now we've gone through, we've listened to Dave and John's webinar here, and we're going through making some changes. We're hardening our infrastructure. We're closing up those holes. But just because we run a tight ship doesn't mean that everybody else runs a tight ship. And there's also some issues with potentially some of your IoT or some of your infrastructure that you may currently have deployed that is on now a not recommended list by the federal government. And so what does that mean? They have an active list, and I'll let you speak to this a little bit more, John, but they're actively recommending that certain vendors have no time and place inside of our infrastructure right now for a variety of reasons. So what happens if an organization has some of that infrastructure deployed? What do we do, John? I think of like cameras and things like that.
Absolutely. And so, in the U.S., what you're referring to is the National Defense Authorization Act, which is passed by Congress every fiscal year. And what a lot of people don't realize is this is passed by Congress. It is a law, okay? And the NDAA, beginning in 2019, and new provisions have come in 2023, essentially prohibits the federal government and those supplying the federal government from entering into or extending contracts with certain companies. And a lot of these are companies from China or associated with the Chinese military, the People's Republic of China. A big one is Hikvision, right? Loads of people have Hikvision cameras, and little do they realize that Hikvision cameras were specifically banned in the 2019 John S. McCain NDAA, and anybody who's doing contracting work for the government or subcontracting work for the government is forbidden from using those products. And it's not just the entity where you have that contract. It is anywhere in your organization. So let's say, one big one that's published well that anybody can find on the internet is, University of California. And so they may have a contract or something they're doing with the government in San Diego. That essentially means that they cannot use Hikvision cameras at any campus anywhere in the state or country for that matter. And, where we see the NDAA come out and start giving us clarity on what to do and what not to do and timelines and that sort of thing are in a lot of the regulations, the acquisition regulations and such that the government creates after the NDAA is passed. So for instance, the Code of Federal Regulations, right? So there's Part 744, and I think it's Section 15, if I remember correctly. But please don't stab me if I'm wrong. But anyways, that federal regulation deals with a lot of these acquisitions of parts. And you are expected to know and comply with these things. And, if you're found to not be, you certainly could not get paid for work, could lose contracts, could lose the ability to enter into future contracts. So it won't just be, I fixed the problem now. They're going to remember that you didn't comply in the first place. So proactively going out there and looking at, the companies that are on there is a big part of what we do in IT cybersecurity to ensure that, we're complying with these regulations and this law. 2023, they passed, and they're actually making it even much more broad, Dave, and that they're expanding it to pretty much semiconductors or companies that produce semiconductors and that sort of thing out of China. Now, they have given us 5 years to implement and comply with that, but it's still a big deal and a lot of work, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And what I often tell people, and they're like, well, I don't have that, so I'm not worried about not getting paid by the government or whatever. What I tell them is the government felt it was a significant enough risk that they created a law and then supporting regulations. Maybe they know something that we should take heed of. So I always suggest to everyone that they comply with these things. Plus, you never know. You may end up years down the road wanting to do work for the federal government, and it's easier to be in a position to do that right away because they will make you attest that you do comply with these things. Sorry, I ran away a little bit there.
No, that's fantastic. That's fantastic information for everyone to know. I know everyone's going to be leaving the webinar now and going and immediately checking to see what brand of cameras they're using in their infrastructure, John. That's the type of information that we want, right? We have great questions just came across, John. And this one here is from Thomas. And it's, can we really assess CSPs or cloud service providers, or do we just have to take their word? And I think what he's getting at there, take their word on their the security practices and stuff like that. And so we'll take this as a two-part. So I'll give my take on this, and then I'll let you jump in there, John. I don't think you can trust what anybody says in regards to their cloud platform. You want to take and do your homework and do your research. Just because somebody has a marketing brochure that says, we have the most secure platform in the world, trust us with your data, everything will be fine. What does that mean? How are you protecting it? What do you do in the event of a breach? Feel free to ask the vendors the really tough questions. What is your incident response plan? Have you ever been breached? And you can leverage a little bit along the lines of your cyber insurance as well, because depending on who these vendors are that you're partnering with, your cyber insurance providers might want some insight into this as well. Because if you're going to have a large policy, they're going to want to have a feel of what it is that you're doing with your infrastructure. And so I think that we need to be diligent as IT professionals and, not being scared to ask these vendors these tough questions. And, it's like, okay, what happens if we have a breach on our side? What happens if we have a breach on your side? And you can quickly evaluate what their security practices are like when you're doing something as simple as setting up single sign-on to one of their applications. And, you're noticing that, this looks a little weak from a security standpoint, because remember that a lot of the solutions that are built out there, they're authored by our friendly developers. And I have nothing against developers. However, I know a lot of developers that are not fans of security because it makes it very difficult for them to code their applications, make their applications work, and support applications in a highly secured infrastructure. It's way easier if we just give everything admin, which we all know we just don't do anymore. So, John, in the lines of that question, assessing CSPs that are out there, what do we have to do?
Well, so I'm going to be very quick, or at least quick for me, on this. And since I've used quotes already today, I'll use another one: trust but verify. It's a Russian proverb of all things, but it was made famous by Ronald Reagan back in 1987 with the signing of the treaty with Gorbachev and that sort of thing. And essentially, this is the approach that I take towards any provider, whether it be an on-prem software provider or a cloud service provider, is, I trust what they say with good faith, but then, this is my part two, I implement something, Dave, that you and I began talking about years ago, and that is our cloud teaming team to really verify that the protections do what they say they're going to do, right? Everybody does this with red and blue teams. They have for years, where they say, okay, well, we're gonna have these exercises to ensure that our good guys can do what they say they can do versus our bad guys over here. But that's tending to focus on penetrations of your on-prem network and that sort of thing, and the security and software solutions designed for it. So you and I started bringing up the concept of, those strategies don't exactly one-to-one, apples-to-apples apply to our security in the cloud. So let's form a cloud team that specializes in understanding the security we've implemented with our CSP, and then, stage some sample attacks and that sort of thing and see, can we penetrate it? Where do we need to increase it? Where do we need to decrease it? And, I totally buy in and commit to that, not just from verifying that the CSP does what they say they're going to do, but often you will find holes in your implementation. You'll find that, oh, you forgot to flip a switch on this thing or configure this other thing. So, using that cloud team approach to verify the trust that you're putting into your CSP is the strategy that I go with every time.
Awesome. And with that, I think we'll hand it back over to the break for our good friend, Mr. David Ramo. And thanks on behalf of John and myself for attending this portion of the webinar, and enjoy the rest of it.
Okay, great job, guys.